Mass cannibalism, it sounds like the stuff of horror movies, right? But what if I told you that one medieval winter left behind a reality that was even more disturbing than any fiction? The historical records may be sparse, but the rumors and whispers of that time have never quite faded away. There was a winter when the truth was so terrifying that it was almost too dangerous to speak about aloud. To understand how everything unraveled, we need to travel back to the year 1315, a year that began like any other, until the weather decided to completely throw things off balance. At first, it was just a few spring showers, nothing too unusual for the time. But these weren't the gentle, refreshing rains of a typical spring. They turned into a relentless downpour that spanned spring, summer, and even fall. Imagine a rain so constant it flooded the fields, transforming them into vast, muddy lakes. Crops couldn't breathe or grow. They rotted away in waterlogged soil before ever reaching their full potential. It seemed as if Mother Nature had forgotten to switch off the rain mode and completely misplaced the manual on how to fix it. Now, keep in mind that in those days, people didn't stockpile food the way we do today. They lived from one harvest to the next, always hoping for a better yield the following season. But with the rains coming down unceasingly, the harvest of 1315 was a complete failure. Families stared in dismay at empty storage bins that just a short while ago had been brimming with their hope for the coming year. These storage bins, once a sign of prosperity, had now become stark reminders of what once was. As if one disastrous year wasn't enough, 1316 brought with it another season of complete crop failure. 2 years of such relentless misfortune were more than anyone could bear. Livestock started dying off because there wasn't enough fodder to feed them. Farmers watched helplessly as their animals dwindled, reducing what was once a thriving source of sustenance to grim statistics of loss. And as if that weren't enough, the heavy rains filled up salt mines, rendering salt just as rare and valuable as gold. Without salt, preserving what little meat people had became nearly impossible. Food spoiled almost as quickly as it could be harvested, and staple items like wheat and rye became luxury goods reserved only for the rich. A loaf of bread, once an everyday necessity, now cost more than what most could earn in an entire week. The constant downpour didn't just ruin the crops, it wreaked havoc on every aspect of daily life. Nothing dried properly, firewood remained soaked, grains were perpetually damp and moldy, and even clothes could never catch enough of a break from the wet. Roads were reduced to impassable mud pits, leaving villages isolated. With such harsh conditions, people began to pack up and leave in search of any shred of food that might still be available. But wherever they went, the devastation was the same. Starvation loomed large, and as desperation reached a fever pitch, people started to turn to sources of food that they would have once thought unthinkable. When you're so hungry that your body is screaming for sustenance and there's nothing left in the pantry, every resource, no matter how odd it might seem, suddenly becomes a potential meal. Ordinary grass, which once filled the meadows, was now being harvested by desperate families. They gathered every blade they could find and boiled it down into a sort of green mush that barely passed as food. Weeds, normally the unwanted plants you'd try to remove from a garden, became precious vegetables that could mean the difference between life and death. The entire landscape shifted in a bizarre way from manicured lawns to what you might call lunch lawns. Even nature's tougher offerings weren't spared. The bark of trees, pine, oak, birch, you name it, was no longer just material for building fires or crafting tools. In this grim scenario, tree bark was stripped away, shredded, and cooked into soups. Trees, it seems, were forced into a role they'd never anticipated, as if they were suddenly being considered for their culinary potential instead of just providing shade or wood. And it wasn't just the plants that got a second life as food. Animal bones, which had already been picked clean by scavengers, were crushed with stones and boiled into a very thin broth, a last desperate attempt to extract every bit of sustenance possible. When you're on the edge of starvation, even items that were once part of your daily life take on a whole new meaning. Leather, for instance, wasn't solely for making clothes and shoes anymore. In these desperate times, belts, boots, gloves, anything made of leather ended up in the pot, boiled down until they were soft enough to be chewed. It sounds absurd, but when hunger becomes the dominant force, Even your wardrobe might double as your only source of nutrition. As if the situation couldn't get any worse, people began to use domestic animals as emergency rations. Pets, like dogs, cats, and even rats, creatures that were once companions, were now just another source of meat. Horses, too, found their usefulness redefined. Their blood was extracted and mixed with the little grain that was left, trying in vain to create something that resembled sustenance. In the absolute extremity of these times, some folks went so far as to collect pigeon droppings, consuming them raw, believing that every bit might help stave off starvation. Even more shockingly, there were instances of people resorting to eating things like moss or lichen scraped off stones or even clay and dirt in a misguided attempt to extract any minerals that their weakening bodies desperately needed. At this stage, traditional ideas about what should or shouldn't be eaten had completely fallen by the wayside. Hunger had a way of erasing everything that once seemed normal or acceptable about food. The unthinkable had become part of everyday life, and in this grim struggle for survival, there was no right or wrong, just a dire choice between nearly anything and nothing at all. But even those desperate measures weren't enough for everyone. When all else failed and every blade of grass, every rat, every piece of bark had been boiled, chewed, or scraped away, some people crossed lines that had never been crossed before, lines that humanity up until that point had only imagined in its darkest stories. That's when the court records began telling a different kind of tale. In Poland, medieval legal documents began to record cases so grotesque they barely seemed real. In a time when starvation ruled, some parents, real, ordinary parents, killed and ate their own children. These weren't villains from fairy tales. These were mothers and fathers who, after watching child after child fade away, were pushed beyond the limits of any moral compass. The justice system didn't even have a name for what was happening. Judges found themselves confronting crimes they'd never imagined needing laws for. In Germany, the records are equally disturbing. In some towns, women were caught and executed for cooking and serving human flesh to their neighbors secretly, believing they were helping the community survive. But when those potlucks were exposed, the horror turned contagious. The very idea of trust was shattered. Suddenly, dinner came with an unspoken fear. What am I really eating? In other villages, desperate sellers brought human flesh to markets disguised as pork. Hungry buyers, unaware, brought the meat home to feed their families. When the truth came out, the shock wasn't just for the customers, it sent whole communities into panic. Trust in butchers, neighbors, even friends, evaporated. The butcher's stall turned from a place of nourishment into a nightmare of deception. Flanders reported a strange, haunting trend. People simply vanishing during the coldest months. No one asked questions. Everyone quietly understood. The missing weren't lost. They had been taken, consumed, disappeared, in the most literal sense. Missing person notices became meaningless because the answers were too grim, too close to home. In some towns, the corpses of executed criminals once left hanging as warnings to others became meals for the desperate. Families snuck out in the dark, risking arrest and public shame to retrieve the dead, not to bury them, but to boil them. Even in death, the human body had value if not as a life, then as meat. Norway and France reported similar practices. In isolated, starving regions, eating the dead wasn't a story, it was routine, a nightmarish kind of survival strategy. And then came the forest roads. During these winters, traveling alone was perhaps the most dangerous thing a person could do. Roads that once carried merchants and pilgrims became hunting grounds. Travelers disappeared, no witnesses, no bodies, just rumors and cold trails. Highway robbery was no longer about stealing money or goods. It was about meat, human meat. But there's a cruel detail here. Cannibalism didn't just emerge randomly. It followed a terrible, consistent pattern. Most families who committed it had already watched one or more members die from starvation. The horror didn't begin on day one. It took 2 whole years of hunger, of watching loved ones collapse before people reached that unimaginable place. And yet, not everyone was equally at risk. The famine created a brutal social hierarchy, a pyramid of survival. At the top were the wealthy, protected by their coin, connections, and hidden stockpiles. At the bottom were the most vulnerable, travelers, orphans, the elderly, the voiceless, those who had no one to defend them, no community to notice they were gone. They vanished in alarming numbers. Travelers, especially, became targets. Passing through a hungry village with no family ties. That was a gamble with your life. Being a stranger meant you were less likely to be missed. Hospitality turned into suspicion, and suspicion into something far worse. Orphaned children wandering between communities often didn't survive long. With no parents, they begged from village to village, and then they disappeared. Old people without relatives, same story. They were considered expendable, especially when food was measured in breaths and bites. In some horrifying cases, villages even sacrificed their own criminals or debtors. Community leaders, doing cold calculations, decided who was most expendable. These weren't spontaneous killings. These were decisions planned, organized, terrifyingly practical. And once again, the phrase village watch took on a very dark new meaning. As burials became impossible in the frozen ground, the dead were sometimes left above ground for weeks. Graveyards were no longer places of rest. They were raided night after night until many towns posted armed guards at cemeteries. The phrase rest in peace became more of a joke, more hope than promise. And if you thought it couldn't get more chilling, some communities developed what can only be described as secret meal-sharing agreements. No one asked where the meat came from, but everyone knew. The rules were unspoken: share, don't ask, survive. Meanwhile, the upper classes had their own strategies. The wealthy fled to safer regions, bribed officials, or quietly opened hidden food reserves. Religious leaders, too, were largely protected. Churches often had better storage, stronger walls, and loyal followers willing to defend their priests and their pantries. It turns out, divine protection was nice, but stocked shelves were even better. The geography also mattered. Remote villages, cut off by impassable roads, suffered the highest rates of cannibalism. Cities had trade routes, communication lines, some semblance of order, but far-flung hamlets, they became islands of desperation. And when help didn't come, the people inside were left to their own terrible decisions. And through it all, through the gnawing hunger and unimaginable choices, the very institutions meant to safeguard the people crumbled. Religious leaders leaned on prayer. They organized fasting rituals and proclaimed that the famine was a punishment from God. But to the starving, these proclamations felt cruelly ironic. When you're already fasting involuntarily, being told to do it on purpose feels like a twisted joke. Priests told the starving to repent, to pray more, to fast more, to seek divine forgiveness for their sins. But what sin causes this? And how do you fast when there's nothing left to eat? Kings weren't much better. Royal authority dissolved in the face of flooded roads and empty storehouses. Crown means little when your kingdom is starving. Even monarchs with riches beyond imagination couldn't conjure food from flooded fields. Grain wouldn't sprout just because the king ordered it to. Jewels couldn't be turned into bread. The nobles, well, many of them saw opportunity in tragedy. They hoarded grain in private vaults or sold it at obscene prices, watching their neighbors' desperation grow. It wasn't just survival, it was profit, and the people didn't forget. The social divide, already deep, cracked wide open. Feudal loyalty had an expiration date, and during the famine, it reached it. The rules of property didn't stop. In fact, they became harsher. Peasants who stole bread were executed, even when they were literally starving to death. Landlords demanded their dues, even as entire families collapsed. Towns began hiring guards to protect food warehouses, not from thieves, but from their own citizens. Markets transformed into battlegrounds. The price of grain made people fight with fists, knives, and anything else they had. Buying groceries now required courage and often a weapon. Definition of shopping had changed forever. The institutional collapse was total. Every layer of medieval society, church, crown, community, revealed its failure in the face of widespread hunger. People who once believed in divine justice or royal protection found themselves completely abandoned. The structures they trusted crumbled just when they needed them most. Eventually, the rain stopped. In 1317, the skies finally cleared. But by then, the damage had already been done. Europe didn't bounce back overnight. In fact, recovery was painfully slow. The land was wounded, soaked, and stripped of everything that had once made it fertile. Fields had to be replanted from scratch. livestock needed to be bred anew. Entire farming systems had to be rebuilt. Not just physically, but emotionally, because the routines people had once depended on were now soaked in trauma. It wasn't as simple as just going back to normal. Famine had torn apart not just the earth, but the very soul of medieval society. People had lost trust in each other, in their lords and in God. They had seen their communities disintegrate. And even as new crops began to grow, the ghost of what they'd done, what they'd endured, haunted every corner of Europe. Hundreds of villages were simply abandoned. Too many had died. Too many had left and never returned. These ghost towns remained for decades, even centuries, dotting the landscape as grim monuments to the famine years. Some were eventually resettled. Others stayed frozen in time, permanent reminders that civilization can unravel far faster than anyone ever expects. Even property values were affected. Entire regions saw land prices collapse. And when a house came with a reputation of its former owner being eaten rather than evicted, buyers were understandably hesitant. Who wants to move into a home with that kind of history? But perhaps the strangest legacy of the Great Famine didn't live in the official records, it lived in the folklore. Suddenly, tales of witches who ate children, of monsters lurking in the woods, of beings that fed on human flesh, these became popular across Europe. Stories meant to scare children into obedience may have had a much darker origin. These fairy tales weren't just imagination, they were echoes of real horrors, cultural memory disguised as bedtime stories. The images of child-eating ogres, cannibalistic witches, and enchanted forests hiding sinister dangers weren't just fantasy. They were coping mechanisms, ways to process, remember, and even deny what communities had once done. It was easier to believe in monsters than to accept that. For a time, the real monsters were ordinary people, driven by hunger. And those stories lived on. Long after the famine ended, long after the rains dried up and the fields grew green again, the stories remained. They spread from town to town, passed down through generations. The unspoken truth, encoded in nursery rhymes and legends. The Great Famine had taught Europe a lesson it wouldn't forget, that civilization is a thin veil. When that veil tears, when the rains don't stop and the grain doesn't grow, people change. Not because they want to, but because they have to, because hunger doesn't negotiate. It consumes everything, even our humanity. From that moment forward, European society began to shift. Communities that survived became more cautious, more guarded. People started thinking differently about food, trade, and risk. Reserves became more common. Storage techniques improved. There was a new kind of urgency, an undercurrent of paranoia that lasted for generations. Even the feudal system, once the backbone of medieval life, began to falter. Peasants who had seen their lords fail them during the famine no longer felt the same loyalty. That trust was broken, and once broken, it couldn't be repaired with words alone. Over time, the balance of power would shift slowly, unevenly, but permanently. The seeds of that change were planted during those rain-soaked, starving years. Historians today look back on the Great Famine, not just as a tragic event, but as a turning point, a dark warning about what happens when society isn't prepared for catastrophe. It wasn't just about food. It was about everything else that came apart with it. Infrastructure, justice, faith, compassion, they all broke under the weight of 3 years of relentless hunger. And what emerged from the other side was a Europe that had been fundamentally altered. So yes, mass cannibalism sounds like something from a horror movie, and in many ways it is. But for thousands of people in the early 1300s, it wasn't fiction. It was a last resort. A horrific answer to a question no one should ever be forced to ask. What would you do if there was absolutely nothing left? The scariest part, this wasn't the result of war. It wasn't a plague. It wasn't man-made. It was rain. Too much rain for too long, a change in the sky that destroyed the ground, and in turn tore apart the people who lived on it. And maybe that's the real warning. Our world, however modern, however stable it seems, is still just as fragile, still just as vulnerable to shifts we can't control. And that sometimes it only takes a few seasons to turn a civilization upside down. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a mirror, a dark one, reflecting not just the weather, but the truth about what we're capable of when we're desperate enough.